Hi everyone, this is Andrew Ty and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the new 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros and whether they're going to be any good for gaming. So like everyone else, I'm very excited about the new upgrades for the chips which are going to be inside these new MacBook Pros. So the first one is the M1 MacBook Pro, which is going to feature an up to 10 core CPU with a 16 core GPU, up to 32 gigabytes of unified memory, and also up to 200 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. And these are huge upgrades over the original Apple Silicon Mac, which was released in November 2020. And furthermore, the surprise announcement was that we have the M1 Max chip. It also features a 10-core CPU and up to a 32-core GPU, up to 64 gigabytes of unified memory, and up to 400 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. Unified memory basically refers to the amount of RAM that the system on a chip has access to at any one time, and this is shared between standard RAM applications and also video memory as well. These brand new chips basically offer a gigantic upgrade over the original Apple Silicon Macs, which were only limited to 16 gigabytes of RAM and only had 4 performance cores and 4 high efficiency cores. So these brand new M1 Pro and M1 Max chips are going to be substantially faster than the original M1 chip. However, how does this affect gaming performance? So this time during Apple's announcement, they have made some interesting charts which show the relative performance of their chips compared to the original M1 chip, and also they're comparing to standard Windows computers too. So this time they have done us the courtesy of actually telling us which computers they're comparing it to. So this 4-core PC laptop refers to an MSI Prestige 14 Evo, and this 8-core PC laptop chip refers to the MSI GP66 Leopard. And this time they have labeled their x-axis. They're showing here the consumption in watts. So it's showing here that the M1 Pro and the M1 Max are going to be using much less power than their Intel PC counterparts. However, this relative performance on the y-axis is not really labeled. It doesn't tell us exactly how they're comparing the M1 Pro and M1 Max against this MSI GP66 Leopard. So it's a bit of a mystery about exactly how powerful this next computer is going to be. So apart from Apple's ambiguous charts and their marketing strategy, there have also been several benchmarks that have been making the rounds. Apple M1 Max hangs with the RTX 3080 laptop in leaked benchmarks. How the M1 Max GPU is 3 times faster than the original M1s. So this is showing the Metal score in Geekbench 5, and also the actual leaked Geekbench 5 scores, which compare the 10-core Apple M1 Max chip against the original Apple M1 chip with 8 cores. And you can see here that the single core score remains virtually the same. However, the multi-core score is almost 50% faster. However, it doesn't necessarily matter how good these performance benchmarks are. Unless we have real-world gaming performance, it doesn't really mean anything to have faster GPU scores. I'm certain that these new M1 Max and M1 Pro chips are going to be much better at productivity tasks like video editing, encoding, decoding, working with really large video files and multitasking. However, it's a little bit suspect on Apple's part that during this entire announcement, despite all of the claims about the massive GPU improvements, we saw nothing about gaming itself. In Apple's 2020 announcement for the M1, they really put gaming front and center, and they showed off tons of games, whether it's games that are on Apple Arcade or even third-party games like Larian Studios' Baldur's Gate 3. It's a little bit worrying considering that there's meant to be such a huge increase in CPU and also GPU power as well. This new M1 Max chip, for example, is meant to have 4 times the number of GPU cores than the original M1. And if this really translated into gaming, then that's something that Apple should be shouting from the roof. It seems like they're keeping their cards close to their chest for this one. So the main point of my video today is that you could have all the performance in the world, but it won't matter at all unless you have the games that can take advantage of that performance. And the first issue is that there aren't really that many games for the Mac operating system. So if you go on a platform like Steam and you compare the number of games compatible for the Mac operating system and compare that to the Windows operating system, the macOS side is tiny in comparison to the number of games on Steam. The second issue is that with these Apple Silicon chips, we have no boot camp. So boot camp is the ability to natively install Windows on a Mac computer. And with Intel Macs, what you used to be able to do is boot camp into Windows and basically play all of the Windows games that you couldn't play on the macOS side. However, with the introduction of Apple Silicon, we no longer have this option. And it's something I don't think is going to happen anytime soon, mostly down to the way that Windows ARM licensing works. I don't think Apple are going to take the steps to license Windows 11 ARM and make it work on the M1 Apple Silicon Mac. And furthermore, Apple's hardware does not meet the Windows 11 ARM's requirements for a TPM 2.0 chip. Apple Silicon Macs currently use the Secure Enclave, which is a kind of security area of the chip, which is meant to store things like biometric data, and acts kind of like a TPM 2.0, But this is not currently compatible with Windows 11 ARM, and therefore I don't think we'll ever be able to natively boot into Windows games on Apple hardware. And also Apple have not made it easy to develop games for the Mac operating system. For example, they have their own proprietary graphics API called Metal, which is reportedly quite difficult to use compared to say something open source like Vulkan. They've also deprecated support for things like OpenGL, and also done things like drop support for 32-bit games and applications, which has basically eliminated a huge number of macOS ports that were 32-bit only. So you can see that from a developer's point of view, they don't have much incentive to port their games onto the Metal Graphics API and put them onto the Mac desktop. And all of these factors contribute to a very low player base for gaming on Mac computers, and that's why there aren't that many games to begin with. So there are some ways to play Windows games on the M1 Apple Silicon Mac. And Parallels is a virtual machine software which supports the operating system Windows 11 ARM, and that has the ability to play a lot of Windows only games. So for example, we're able to emulate x86 64-bit games onto the ARM architecture, and this is virtualized on the Apple Silicon Mac. I also have tutorials on this and plenty of benchmark videos which you can check out in the description. There's also a method of running Windows games called crossover, which uses the wine compatibility layer, which translates Windows API calls into macOS API calls. And this opens up the possibility for a lot of Windows games to be played on Apple Silicon hardware. However, despite these methods existing and performing very well for some specific games, a lot of the very most popular games that people want to play now, for example Valorant, New World, Smite, Red Dead Redemption 2, Cyberpunk 2077, they're simply not compatible with these methods because they make use of DirectX 12, which is not currently supported by Parallels or Crossover. So if you wanted to play those games specifically, then you're completely out of luck. It's very likely you'll never be able to play these games unless a lot more work is done on these compatibility layers or virtual machine softwares. So the last real remaining option is cloud gaming. So if you wanted to play, for example, Cyberpunk 2077, you could sign up to a cloud gaming service like GeForce Now, and you could simply stream the game using your internet connection if it is fast enough. And you'll get an acceptable performance level depending on the latency of your internet connection. But if you're going to go through the trouble of cloud gaming, then it's kind of pointless spending all of this money on an upgraded M1 Pro or M1 Max computer, or you might be served better by simply buying the cheaper MacBook and then buying a dedicated gaming device, for example a Switch or a gaming PC or gaming laptop. Those devices are going to have a much broader compatibility with a much larger range of games. However, personally, I'm very excited about these new chip upgrades because they open up some new possibilities. So firstly, there are plenty of macOS games and some very high quality ones too. So I just released a video where I show off 100 games that can be played on the M1 Apple Silicon Mac, whether those games have been ported to native ARM, or they run through the Rosetta 2 Intel translation layer, or they run through the crossover compatibility layer, or they run through the Parallels virtual machine. There are literally hundreds of games that you can play, and you should definitely check out the M1 compatibility games master list, which features a huge list of games which are all compatible with the Apple Silicon Mac. As long as there are some games on this list that you find enjoyable, then I'd say that the M1 Pro and the M1 Max might be a good upgrade for you too. Personally, what I'm most excited about with these chips is the increased RAM availability. That's going to make quite a large difference running games through the Parallels virtual machine. That's because virtual machines tend to consume half of the system's resources, so therefore half of the RAM and half of the CPU cores. And with an increase in RAM and CPU on the M1 Max in particular, this opens up the possibility of compatibility with more Windows games on the platform. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful. If you have any requests for games that you want me to benchmark on the M1 Pro or the M1 Max, please leave a comment in the description. Please like, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.